Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BattleBots Design Panel. My name is Kyle Kroos. I'm one of the co-hosts of the weekly podcast Behind the Bots, where we share news from the world of combat robotics and in-depth interviews with BattleBots builders past, present, and future. Today, it's my great pleasure to lead a conversation with Orion Beach from HiJinx and Skorpios, Leanne Cushing from Valkyrie, Emmanuel Carrillo from MadCatter, Cat King and Warhawk, Isaak Malers from Malice, and Ellis Ware from Pulsar, Magnetar, Great White, and Sandstorm. These folks are all crucial parts of the design collaboration on their respective teams. So we have represented here a pretty diverse array of design experience and backgrounds, and I'm looking forward to getting into design process and philosophy with them over the next hour. So before we get started, with all of our listener questions, I'd like to remind you guys that you can add questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen right next to the chat function. We already have dozens of questions in the queue, but we'll do our best to get to most, if not all of your questions live. So to kick us off, I'd love to do a quick round of introductions. We'll start with Ellis. Ellis, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and the path that kind of led you to robot design, if you will?
Put me on the spot there. So I'm Ellis. I'm 24 years old. I've been building robots since, when? 2012 officially was my first competition. So I was, like most people, I was a fan of the original show. In my case, it was Robot Wars in the UK. I discovered BattleBots on YouTube a little bit later on. And I just wanted to get involved from a very young age. Unfortunately, like most 7-year-olds, I didn't necessarily have the ability. But fast forward a bit to my early teens, I was looking for something to do with my time. And I'm very fortunate to have very supportive parents who they were like, well, if you can figure out what to buy and how to actually do it, then we'll maybe, try and help you get to a competition one day. And so that's more or less what happened. And I started in the 30-pound class, the featherweight class. And I learned how to be an engineer, if that's even a thing, by the method of building more robots. And so in order to build more better robots, I needed to gain skills. I needed to learn how to use CAD packages, started off with SketchUp and then, migrated to SolidWorks Inventor, and I currently use SolidWorks and that sort of thing. So it's just been a journey like that, really. Through that, I've managed to meet some awesome people, get on some TV shows and have a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you for being the British wing of our panel today. We really appreciate you being here.
No problem.
I'd like to move on to Isaak. So Isaak, can you tell us who you are and what you do and what kind of path led you to robot design? Isaak? Oh, there we go. He was muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Hi, buddy.
Because I got auto-muted. I'm a software engineer. Kind of the path that led me to doing robots is that I really like working in multiple disciplines, whether it's mechanical and software or electrical, and robotics is kind of the culmination of all of those. So I just really enjoy pulling everything together across the board.
I like that very much. All right, and then also with us today is Leanne Cushing. Leanne, if you could tell us who you are and what you do and what led you into this crazy path.
Sure. I'm Leanne Cushing. I'm the captain of Valkyrie on the current BattleBot show. I've had a robot problem since 2002. So yeah, 18 years now. I started on First Robotics rather than BattleBots, and I've changed. Well, I still appreciate First, but instead of mentoring teams now, I like to just build. And then by my profession, I am a professional designer, a mechanical engineer. So
very cool. Next, I'd like to talk to Orion Beach. So Orion, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and what got you into this crazy sport?
I'm Orion Beach. I'm, I guess, the lead designer and engineer for HiJinx for this season on BattleBots for my team Offbeat Robotics. And I currently work at Autodesk at one of their technology centers in San Francisco as their CNC shop supervisor. So yeah, I help people build and design some pretty cool stuff. How I got to what I'm doing in fighting robots. I started in about 2003 with fighting robots, late 2003. My friend Zachary Lytle got me into it. We went to the same junior college in Santa Rosa. And yeah, I had already taken some CAD classes, and I ended up changing my engineering degree over to machine tool technology. And I ended up spending a lot of time as a machinist professionally. And I've also spent time as a mechanical engineer at a couple different companies. So yeah, it's kind of my background.
And next I'd like to move over to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, if you could tell us who you are and kind of what you do and what got you into this sport.
Yeah, I'm Emmanuel Carrillo. I'm an industrial designer, so I went to school for industrial design. I guess like day to day, that just means I do product design and kind of help companies create everything, anything. But I guess how I got into robots, I was in high school. I did FIRST robotics, and we were like I was like the first class in my high school that I did it. So we were really bad. So I didn't do it much after high school, but I guess after the season 1 reboot, I remember seeing that and being like, oh, I remember loving that as a kid, and kind of searched out and found out that there was local competitions up here in Seattle, and went to them and started small, and then kind of made my way up to the big class. So yeah, that's at least the short and sweet of it.
Nice. So Emmanuel, let's just stick with you while we go into kind of my first question. This is a question that I wanted to ask you guys just to kind of set the mood for the panel before we dove into the listener questions. So tell us what the keystone of your design process is when it comes to combat robotics. Do you start with a shape? Do you start with a weapon type? Do you start with an aesthetic theme, a movement dynamic? What is your kind of basis that you start from, and how does that inform your process?
I guess for me, I tackle it from, what's the main, the hardest problem to solve. And that for most of us is just getting it to work. So I lay out all the base components, wheels, drivetrain, kind of weapons in like a block. And then from there, arrange it into a general shape, and then go from there. I'm like, what can this actually look like? But in the end, this needs to move. It needs to kind of have power. And so I just lay out the bulk components in kind of in a plane in CAD, and just see what that lends itself to. And then we can start getting creative once we kind of have the base down. But from the start, it's, what makes it work, and then skin it.
Got it. All right, so I'd like to ask the same question, kind of moving backwards down the line. So Orion, what is the keystone of your design process? What do you like to start with when you're looking at a new BattleBot? And considering that you've put together 2 for the TV show, I think that you might have some interesting insight.
Yeah, both Rex and Skorpios. I did a lot of design work for, obviously, and then working on a 3rd design, getting onto BattleBots. So BattleBots is a little different. Most open competitions, I kind of look at what's currently out there in the weight class that I'm building for, and then I'll try and figure out something that I think will do well against most of that field. So like when I built Electric Boogaloo for the heavyweight division, that field was full of articulated wedge robots, lifter robots, and last rights. So I didn't build a robot to fight last rights. I built a robot to fight a bunch of wedges. So that's why I built a vertical spinner. And then I had to kind of adapt it to fight a big horizontal spinner. So that's a lot of what goes into it. BattleBots has this other constraint, which is you have to be able to get in first. So like you can have the most competitive, winningest design ever, submit it and get rejected. And that's definitely what happened season 1 for us when we submitted to BattleBots. And we had a couple options. We could have put a bunch of things on it to make it look more cool, or we could have submitted something kind of wild and crazy. And the team I was with at the time was like, let's do wild and crazy. And that's where Rex came from. So
that was a very fun robot.
Yeah, it's pretty silly.
All right, so I'd like to move over to Leanne and ask you the same question. So Leanne, what is your keystone when it comes to design? Is there a specific element you like to start with first, a shape, practical ability? What kind of gets you going, and how does that inform your process?
Sure. So for Valkyrie specifically, it was sort of Fred had the initial idea, but we're both kind of like, what will get us on the show? What will be interesting? And so that's kind of, we knew we had to look good and we had to bring something that was unique. And so at the time there was no other like undercutter. So we're like, well, let's go with that. And the shape was sort of an idea that Fred had. And from there, we just started to play with like sort of component placement and how we could make a thing stable. And that's sort of how the shape started to evolve. And Alex did a lot of the like super complicated angles in Fusion 360 actually, because it's impossible to do in SolidWorks.
Yep.
And then, yeah, for other robots, it's usually either a theme that's something silly comes up and then just sort of pursue that, or for like, if I'm curious about how a robot is built or like what the limits or something of it, like I made a 30-pound hammer bot just because I was curious to see like what annoyances and what benefits does a hammer have versus making a high kinetic like weapon. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Fair enough. All right, so I'd like to move over to Isaak. Isaak, you just put together your first robot with your team, first big heavyweight for BattleBots. Can you tell us what that process was like, what the keystone to that design process was, and what kind of informed your decisions from there?
Yeah, I would say that the first thing that I look at in general, maybe not for Malice, is what kind of weapon I want to use and what the win condition for the robot is, so how the weapon is going to work to damage the opponent. When I joined Malice, that was kind of already sorted out. We already had kind of the design archetype. So the second thing I look at is kind of weight and placement of components. So you're going to have some components that you can't change for whatever reason. Like maybe you have a particular motor that you want to use because of it's what you're familiar with, or you have a particular part kind of already laying around, or you already have kind of the part of the robot that is really the soul of it that you have in mind that you can't change. So it's important to like weigh all those out and kind of get those in the model and see what is left for the rest of the robot, like what your options are in terms of weight and components. And once that's done, I'll typically start kind of laying stuff out on a plane in CAD. To kind of get like a 2D projection of what the shape of the robot will be, kind of fitting in those non-variable components, right? And generally it's easier the less non-variable components you have, but if you have nothing to go off of, like you are leaving everything up in the air, it's really hard because you just are overwhelmed with choices. And then from there, I'll kind of iteratively build out the rest of the design. I usually don't stop until I'm happy with it. So a lot of my robots have a lot of iterations.
That, I think, is probably common with a lot of folks on this panel. All right, so we'll move on to Ellis last with this question. Ellis, can you kind of tell us what the keystone of your design process is on some of the bots that you've built for the different shows that you've been on?
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting is actually taking a step back from the TV show stuff and, you know, the stuff I've done in more recent times. I mean, everyone here is pretty well established in the sport, and so the process that we have now might actually be quite different, to at least how I started early on and how someone who's just getting into the hobby might kind of go about developing a design. So I definitely would say go back to the beginning of me doing this, then it was, as the others have said, almost entirely component driven. So it's often costs to be lower and availability of certain, you know, components, or simply your experience limitations would mean that you're kind of much more what you end up designing is shaped much more by what you have access to and what you can build around. So I can think of a perfect example for that is my second featherweight back in 2012. We knew we wanted to do a sewer snake style weapon. which later on became Sandstorm, 6-8 years later or whatever. But at that time, we didn't know how to do that, but we knew it had a big motor and we didn't know how to get a big motor. So we actually found a big cordless drill literally in the dump. And so then I modeled that in SketchUp and built the entire robot around that. And so that would be a very normal process, I think, if you're starting out in this hobby. But of course, then as you get more comfortable over time, with your skill set, your knowledge, the components that are available to you, and your costs go up, budgets go up, especially in the TV show world, then suddenly it's a lot less, at least in my case, about what your limitations are and much more about simply what you want to do. I can think of my most recent build that actually a lot of people may not have seen properly is the Hounds, which was a clusterbot, drum clusterbot, 55 kilos each in the heavyweight class for King of Bots. And that was done in collaboration with Andy from Team Rapid over here in the UK. And we weren't that worried about the components and what we were going to use to do that design. We started off with the cool idea of just let's do the most competitive clusterbot that we can come up with. And so we thought, well, drum spinners, vertical spinners, we all know, and four-wheel drive, we all know that works. So we kind of started there and tried to make a cool shape within that, and then figured out components to fit in it. So what that actually means from a CAD point of view, actually designing point of view today is pretty much the same as the others. I tend to start in 2D space, it'd be a sketch on the main axis planes of the CAD kind of environment. I know approximately, well, that's probably going to be an 80mm motor here, and I want this sort of size wheel, and you can start to see it in 2D, and then start positioning the components and then building a shape around that. That would be a fairly standard process for me.
So we're going to move right into listener questions, and I'm going to stick with you, Ellis, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So we've got a few that came in over the question sessions earlier this week. So the first is from Rara Granger. So does the boy genius moniker get annoying or apply additional pressure when building?
I don't know if I can answer this without screwing myself over one way or the other, but so I mean, I'm going to tell the truth. It does did get annoying at the time. It was always just a gag, and people who haven't done the TV show bit maybe don't understand that the way that you answer questions in an interview setting and on the TV shows is that you're kind of asked to repeat the question in the answer, so that then it makes sense when you're editing. And so, or on the show. So then they pose the question, you've been called a boy genius. What do you think about that? So I repeated this in the answer, and that was my grave mistake. And the editing gods took me around town for that. So ever since, that's been my moniker. I wouldn't say it gives me any pressure. It's silly at the end of the day, but it's kind of been there all along. It definitely annoyed me a lot more back then. These days, who cares? But yeah, I never felt comfortable. I never appreciated the idea that it wasn't me doing it, or maybe it was like mummy and daddy's money or something, and the whole boy genius bit. Yeah, that gets annoying because it's just not the truth. But no, it doesn't bother me anymore, not really.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you for being so candid about that. So next question is from BattleBot superfan Mary Catherine Carr. So you've had teammates from around the world. What is that like, and what weight class are you most excited to design for?
Ooh. Well, teammates is a weird one because for a long time, and I'd still say I'm primarily a lone wolf in the sport. When I started out, it was mostly being done with my dad, basically. And then I kind of took over with wanting to learn more about engineering. He had some DIY tools in the shed. That's the sort of thing. And then over time, I gained the skills and it kind of became much more my thing. And so they were, my team was essentially me plus my parents for quite a long time. And then for the international shows, I teamed up with Steve from Death Roll to do the first King of Bots. And in that particular case, I actually wasn't that involved in the main machine. With Great White, I built Neon, the little mini bot, or Remora, I think it was technically called.
Yep.
But it was super great hanging out with Steve. It was my first experience of having a teammate that wasn't either myself or my parents. And he's a super cool guy. I think we probably all met him here. So that was awesome. And then the other name that people will possibly know from the sport is, as I said earlier, Andy from Team Rapid. And that was probably the first experience I've ever had with working with a team member who has my same skill set or same, like obviously maybe not exact same skill set, but at least designs and builds his own robots that are very competitive and very good. And so it was interesting collaborating literally on a day-to-day basis of kind of like, well, he, for example, I'm remembering on the Hounds, he majored on the gearboxes whilst I majored on the weapon design and that sort of thing. And that was a really unique experience from my point of view. And I would definitely do it again. And then finally, I'll mention Giles, my buddy from Reading, who is in the UK scene. I think Emmanuel will remember him, perhaps. He had the dreads, he cut them all off. And so he has got an awesome eye for visuals as a designer. That's a sort of like 3D modeling, but more from like a video game side. So he was really able to pull out that style that we were going for with Sandstorm. So I've worked with loads of different people. And it's been really good. What was the follow-up question?
So what weight class are you most excited to design for?
It changes. I don't know if I have a single favorite. I really, really want to go back to featherweights and do an awesome featherweight. It's actually been quite a long time since I did a new feather. It's been 3 years. So I want to do something awesome from a block of metal, using all of the new resources I've got now manufacturing in China and stuff in my back pocket. So probably featherweights will be my next step. And then obviously the TV show stuff is always fun.
Absolutely. And then
but exhausting.
Next question is from Tom Brisbourne. So what was your favorite robot from the original UK Robot Wars series?
This might sound a bit odd to people, but I think it's probably Tornado. I was a big fan of the 4-wheel drive pusher. I don't know why. That and Storm 2, similar idea. In fact, my first handle, my first username on the FRA forum back when I was being an annoying brat when I joined in 2009 and just asking stupid questions when I was 12, was Relentless, because the whole idea of those pusher bots at the time on the TV shows was that they're relentless, and I wanted to call my featherweight Relentless. Turns out someone already did, so that dream was dead instantly. But there you go. Probably one of those too.
All right, and last questions from me specifically. So you've now designed bots for competitions in 2 continents, but you haven't made the jump across the pond yet to compete in BattleBots. I know you've thought about it. So what factors would you take into account when designing for BattleBots?
I feel like, and I'm sure everyone would agree, that obviously the UK show Robot Wars has always got that more kind of shed-built sort of, frankly, just being blunt about it, smaller budget sort of vibe to it. And so I've always tried to be on the top end of that if I can. But it's quite a different scene. And then the China shows, I've got a lot of show, a lot of theatrics, quite high budget because they've got budget there. But BattleBots is a bit different. It sort of marries the two, where it's obviously high budget, but not quite in the same way. It definitely is the forefront of the sport from a pure competitiveness point of view, even though there's still the visual and kind of crowd-pleasing side to it. And so the reason I've never necessarily jumped in just yet is I know that if/when I compete on BattleBots, I need to make sure that I'm building the best version of whatever I can come up with possible. Not only because that's the level of the competition, but also I wouldn't necessarily go onto the world stage or the big stage with anything that I'm not super confident is not going to be embarrassing. So if and when I think about BattleBot stuff, it's always, I think like everybody here, trying to marry function and form in the most optimum way. And so I possibly hold my standard for that a bit higher than is ideal, because it means that I'm less inclined just to do anything, just to try and get on the show. I'd rather try and be as competitive as possible. So I'd be trying to really finely balance that kind of form and function line. And I haven't quite cracked what I want to do yet. So, and I know I probably need to get a move on, but it'll happen, hopefully.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to move over to Isaak for a few fan questions. So the first one is from somebody you might have heard of. His name's David Rush. He says, you've made some bold claims about robot components that could be 3D printed instead of machined and still hold up just as effectively. Are there any components that you wouldn't even attempt to 3D print?
I think that now that TPUs and nylons and other kind of more flexible, more durable filaments are available, there really isn't anything I wouldn't 3D print. I've fought in full combat classes with a plastic ant that I just printed out of nylon, and it worked great. My main ant weight has a 3D printed weapon axle. There is nothing in the insect classes that I don't think you could 3D print and still be competitive. Maybe like a drum spinner, or there's certain like archetypes you couldn't really pull off very well, but certainly you can build a 100% 3D printed robot in ants and beetles and be competitive, in my opinion.
So from Jessica Phi, what were the biggest challenges you faced when machining the body for Malice?
The biggest challenge with that was the height of the robot. So one of the components with Malice that we kind of set in stone at the very start was the ME909 motor. And we did that because it's really the simplest setup that we could find. There's not a whole lot of electrical experience with heavyweights on our team. So we just wanted to get the easiest, most bulletproof motor setup. But that motor is not compact, to put it mildly. And that drove the height of the chassis. We used 12-inch wheels and a 10-inch tall chassis. And for every additional inch of chassis thickness, the cost just increases exponentially, and the difficulty to machine things just increases exponentially. So the challenge is really how to slice that up into layers to reduce the cost and reduce kind of the difficulty of getting that machined.
That's interesting. Bringing like team ability into the design isn't something we've discussed yet. So I'm glad that you kind of brought up that point. All right. So another question from somebody you might know, Bunny Sariel. What's your favorite tool to use when testing for strength of a material?
My other robots. every time I'm testing new materials or testing new chassis or new designs, I have a test box, and I put the old part in the box with my robot and wail on it for a few minutes and see how it holds up. And if it looks like it's going to hold up well, then I'll make the swap. But if I'm finding, it's more than just the part, it's finding a geometry that complements the part well. So I can either make tweaks to the geometry to try and make that particular material work better, or I can switch the material out to hopefully get some better properties.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so Brent Kerr wants to know, why did you choose to use UHMW for such a large portion of Malice? Now, this is interesting to me. I didn't know you used UHMW for a large portion of Malice. So yeah, explain that thought process.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of UHMW and flexible materials in general. I kind of have a mantra when I'm designing a robot that every part has an amount that is acceptable for that part to flex, right? So if you're talking about your wheels, they probably flex a lot. You can make those out of low density foam, and they can really squish, and it's not going to really impact the performance of the part. And then maybe like armor around the edges of your robot, there's not really anything bad that's going to happen if that flexes quite a bit, right? And the more it flexes, the more it can absorb impacts instead of becoming cracked or dented or shattered in some other way. And so in general, every part of the robot that I can make flexier or squishier, I do. And so there are big parts of Malice where it doesn't really need to be stiff in that portion of the robot, right? The worst case scenario is if a hammer hits the top of it and the UHMW flexes in an inch. Well, we've got inches of foam around all our batteries. Nothing's bad going to happen. So so Malice and all of my robots in general kind of either have really, really stiff materials or really, really flexy materials. So on Malice, that manifests as we've got kind of the AR-500 front structure that's designed to keep the belt tensioned and keep the weapon in place and make sure we're not gonna hit ourselves. And then the entire rest of the robot is kind of designed to be as flexy as possible.
Ooh, that's gonna be fun to watch in the box. I'm really excited about that. All right, so next questions that we're moving on to are for Leanne. Leanne, we're actually gonna start with a question from me just because I'm super curious. So your team has been diving deeper and deeper into the pool of generative design. Can you tell us about that integration and how it's affected your process? And then also, can you tell us a little bit about what materials you find work best as a generative design components?
Okay, yeah. I mean, we use Autodesk's generative design stuff. Orion, because you work there. Anyways, so yeah, what I like the way they explain it as it's sort of just an additional set of tools that is being placed like that's like computational. It's similar to how CAD has become like game changing for engineers. Like one of my old coworkers would rant on about like having to have a drafting board and like stupid amounts of angles like to draw out and then slowly design a part that way, whereas now 3D modeling can expedite that. So that's sort of how generative design is changing product design or manufacturability, or like it's an option you can have that may or may not improve your robot. For us, we recently showed off our frame rails. We're saving about like 0.2, 0.3 pounds per frame rail, and they look pretty. It's not particularly cheap. I'd say that last year our implementation of generative design was only with anything that we could also just metal 3D print, because Markforged is one of our sponsors and they help us with that. That makes it so you don't have to worry about having extensive CNC time. Like I remember ogling over Quantum's robot when we first got in for the season last year, and we were printing a lot of parts for them too. And they were saying they're on 24-hour cycles of just watching the metal just get cut, and it just took that long. So if you have a lot of dollars, generative design is awesome. Or if you just want to 3D print something, like if it's going to be for a lower weight class, or maybe a component that's on the like interior that you won't see or won't get beaten about, that's a good way to use it at the moment. I'm excited to see how it continues to be used. Like if you, the Autodesk library for generative design is starting to grow. And so it's kind of just, if you're a super nerd about random applications for stuff, I'd recommend just going and clicking through and seeing like how certain companies are using it for improved like structure or architecture or whatever. It's really, really pretty. And I think it is going to really change how engineering moves forward for certain disciplines. Like I see a lot of like bike tech getting pretty cool. Yeah.
So fan questions for you from Rara Granger. What's Valkyrie's defense against hammers like? Asking for a friend, this friend is me. And then she put a heart emoji and an elephant emoji.
Oh. Well, technically we did face a hammer, well, an axe, Ragnarok last year, but we didn't really get to see, besides having a very steep wedge, what we were facing. Like we punched them out with like one hit. So I don't know for sure, but we do purposely have modular armor options across the robot to change out and strengthen. So we actually do have a hammer strategy, which is putting additional armor on top with some vibration damping. So we have a plan, but we don't know how well the plan works still. So yeah, maybe we'll see.
Just a random compliment from me. I love how modular your bot is, and yet it maintains this same like through line of aesthetic with every module you put on it. It's really cool. One of the things I love the most about Valkyrie. Okay,
Alex
so
pretty. I love pretty.
well, it's very pretty. All right, so from BattleBot superfan Mary Catherine Carr, what's it like being the only girl in a room full of men on a panel of designers? And then her follow-up question, which I think is also very important. Now that Valkyrie is a bi-coastal team, which coast is the best coast?
Well, I'm going to say West Coast, best coast. And I think that's just more me selfishly speaking from the amount of robot jobs that are out here. So, yeah, I'm going nuts missing Boston. Like right now, Massachusetts has a fine you $500 a day if you don't follow a 2-week quarantine if you go to the state. Because I was kind of feeling lonely and missing my team. So I was looking at, is it feasible to do that? And then the answer is currently no. But yeah, the being in a room or a panel with a bunch of guys, being a mechanical engineer as a lady, you don't usually have any or many female coworkers. I've kind of got used to it. Actually, I started a new job a couple of months ago, and during my interview, one of my teammates who I've gotten to be friends with now, but he asked me just point blank, like, so if you haven't noticed in your interview process, you've not spoken with any girls, is that going to be an issue? And I was like, no, like I have a problem with things I like generally aren't very popular with ladies. Punk music, not very much. Robots, not too much. Getting there though, especially like I'm noticing at small, like younger ages, there's a lot more balance. So I'm hopeful. And whenever I do end up having lady coworkers, it's always like a bonus because you can talk about certain things you can't with just men. Not all men, but like makeup, for example. Only some of my guy friends are into makeup. There's a lot more girls that are. So, yeah.
All right, so we've got a question from the chat from Brad Rowan, who wants to know, how has your professional experience as an engineer influenced your design of combat robots and vice versa?
Well, the manufacturability and the cost of stuff definitely helps. And I've actually found that the nice thing about robots is if you mess up, you don't get fired. So I do try a lot of weirdo things where like, I'm just gonna see what happens when you do meh. And that sort of helped with putting it into like real life work too, is like when you're staring at a problem, I usually iterate through like other ways. I've seen something be done, like linear motion is one of those things that there's only so many ways to do it. And sometimes some of the creativity you'll see in smaller weight classes, especially usually someone not technically 4-year school trained or whatever, I usually like seeing the different ways solutions are there. And sometimes I do drag them into whatever I'm working on or crazy harebrained things for work. Yeah, I don't know. I think that my whole team is professionally engineers too, or fabricators. So that's kind of helped a bit. I know whenever we are at competition, that helps a ton. Like Amanda knows way more than me with fabricating and welding stuff. And so being able to be like, okay, we need to patch a panel, like when Hypershock ripped a panel in half in the first couple seconds of our fight. That was okay, we need to patch this, we don't have a spare. And Amanda was able to sort of figure out how well the patch job was done and what we could do moving forward. And so it's yeah, I think that having professional experience helps. And I do, well, I mean, it's just a robot problem. My job's robots and the hobby's robots, so.
That helps. All right, so let's move on to Orion. So Orion, we have some fan questions for you. The first and foremost is from superfan Mary Catherine Carr. Do you feel like HiJinx has an advantage in the upcoming season because you've managed to keep it under wraps even from other BattleBots teams?
So we haven't kept it totally under wraps, but we definitely have made that move because of some of the early reactions from some of our friends who also build. So we shared our design with a few other builders. You know, it's kind of one of the things that we do behind the scenes is like, hey, how do you want to solve this? What do you think of this solution to this problem? And we had some of our fellow builders come back with, we made a special weapon for you. And yeah, so it was definitely at that point I started thinking about just keeping it under wraps as much as possible. And that's usually what I do for a new design that came out. Like before we brought Electric Boogaloo to Rebel Games, the only content that Dan and I put up on social media was Dan playing around in a bunch of cardboard tubes. And then it showed up at the competition and got a silver medal. So Skorpios, all we released was like the logo, which had a scorpion thing in it, and then it showed up and did things. So yeah, I generally like, I try and keep stuff a little bit under my hat before it shows up to its first competition. just so people don't get a chance to build a specific attachment just for you with a lot of forethought. Like, I don't mind if they cobble something together at the competition, you know, but like if they're thinking of a whole configuration, there's a few design aspects on the robot that I'm not going to say are totally unique, but definitely the combination of them presents a unique challenge. And it's pretty easy to tell what to do about that when you've seen a render of the robot. So yeah, I think there's going to be some advantage. Just people not ready for what we've got, but we definitely do have a plan to reveal the robot whenever it's appropriate. So yeah.
We're all really excited for that day to come.
Yeah.
All right, so the next part of Mary's question, I'm going to kind of elaborate on. So when Jen was on our show, she referred to you as the safety dad of BattleBots. So her question is, can you please share with us a moment when you went full safety dad while designing and or building? And I'm going to add a little bit to that. So knowing you as the safety dad, as Jen described you, I also can't help but notice that a major component to Skorpios is a giant steel wedge slash plow on the front of it. Is defense and safety a key component to your designs?
Okay, all right, I'll tackle the first part of that. So it was last season. Sometimes they blend together. They are quite the marathon. Last season, my friend Jerry, who had Kronos, was out in the welding area repairing his robot. I believe it was after the Copperhead fight. Anyways, after one of his fights, and he was fixing his robot, and the whole shell of his robot is magnesium alloy, and he has titanium and steel bits that bolt to that and to this big assembly. And he was trying to get some of that broken stuff out, and he was grinding and on the magnesium and then grinding on steel and titanium like in the same area, and he had a little magnesium fire, which is actually kind of hard to do. It doesn't light off very easily, but he had titanium there to shoot some white hot sparks into it. And my response was I went over and grabbed the fire extinguisher and had it ready to blast his feet and work area, and Jen whipped out her phone and took a picture.
Nice.
So just different priorities. As far as like defense on the robots, I always like having for the robots a side that I can point towards my opponent and not have to worry about it. Like if you look at Skorpios and you look at Electric Boogaloo, they have extra armor on the front, the side that has a weapon on it, so that you can just keep that part pointed at your opponent. And both those robots on the back aren't as armored. Electric Boogaloo only had a 16th inch of mild steel welded to the back, similar to Elastrites and Tombstone. And Skorpios had more. It had 3/16 AR400 on the back.
Yeah.
But I like that focused strategy of one side. And there are some exceptions to that. I mean, there are some times when turning your robot around a different direction might make sense. But it's difficult because you have to make that choice of like, I'm going to turn the robot around and attack with this side. And it's easy to get lost in that decision-making process in the heat of a fight.
That makes perfect sense. All right, and then we have a few fan questions for Emmanuel. The first one is from Bunny Sariel. Thanks for bringing so much to the community with your free 150-gram plastic designs in Thingiverse. Do you ever end up fighting your own designs at competitions?
Yeah, actually, a lot of those. Well, lately there hasn't been competition, so I just will put them out there and you know, hope that other people will kind of tell me what's wrong with them, and I can update and do phase one. But before, I would always at least build it, make sure that it was somewhat competitive. and then release the files, because I wanted to make sure that if people are going to take the time to build and make this kit and get all the parts that I recommend, that it's going to work. So they're always at least bench tested against each other. The super, if they're like true full combat, I won't release them until they've at least had one set of battles under there, just so that someone doesn't build it and then it just happens to explode the first time it actually gets in a competition. But for the most part, it all gets tested. I mean, I'll do 10, 12 different variations to optimize it to make it as easy to print, as easy to assemble as possible before putting it out there, just because people who are usually getting these kits or looking for kits are going to want a little bit of an easier assembly process than someone who's making from scratch might be able to work around a few little problems. But in general, they're designed to be as easy to put together as possible.
Gotcha. All right, so the next fan question comes from Blacksmith Captain Al, who wants to know, can I use wubs in shear?
If the question is, can you? The answer is yes, you can. Should you? Depends on what your intended result is, but can you? Absolutely, you can do anything.
I mean, it worked more often than not.
I mean, we went all of season 1 in BattleBot, or season 2, I guess, in BattleBots, no problems, all the way up to the final 16. In China, we used them, no problems. In reality, we started testing the ones we had last season, and we were able to actually separate them by hand, as opposed to like the batch we had from a season before, were a lot more robust.
Gotcha.
And I don't know if it was different manufacturers or different just batch, but we went through all the ones we had as spares and we're like, these are just literally falling apart on us. So it didn't surprise us that we had the epic splits. But in the end, it makes for a memorable fight and memorable loss, and that's more important than, or at least that to me makes the show better. And you can't, I mean, I'm sure Greg and Trey couldn't ask for a better outcome in a fight than that.
Absolutely. So this is a question for me. You spend a lot of time collaborating with a variety of teams and designers. What's your favorite design tool for collaboration?
Like Google Hangouts, Teams, Zoom. You really can't beat just getting on a call and just spinning cat around and just going over things. With these like larger assemblies, it gets tough to do proper management. I mean, there's entire companies that are dedicated to how do you get 5 or 6 engineers working on a program. SolidWorks has like a whole system built in, check in, check out parts. And for what we're doing, it's not everyone has a different process, everyone has a different way of building, so it ends up being a little bit tricky. We end up just if for MadCatter, we have Calvin was doing the kind of the hammer assembly and I was doing the drive pod, so we just said, hey, these are the fixed lock points, build within here, and then in the end I'm just going to drop your assembly in, mate it, and go, and then we'll just kind of be on Zoom going back and forth. But doing a proper top-down integration, like proper manufacturing collaboration, it's too time consuming and for kind of the rapid pace that we work at. So yeah, it's a lot of just, hey, don't make sure it fits here, and I'll give you 2 parts, and that's kind of the scope of it.
All right, so we are rolling up on the end of our time here. So I wanted to throw kind of a last question at you guys, and we'll go back down the line kind of in reverse to answer this last question. So the last question that I have is, how do you select the best material for a robot part? Are there a bunch of trade-offs between different materials such as density, tensile strength, ductility, and hardness? And in what situations would aluminum, titanium, steel, or magnesium be most beneficial? I think we can sum this question up by saying, what's your favorite material? Emmanuel, go ahead and start it off.
Like Isaac, I've been a fan of just, starting to 3D print things, at least for the smaller weight classes. A lot of, I guess, starting out, I guess, like Ellis was saying, you know, there's a whole bunch of constraints that kind of lead to creativity, and being able to just, you know, if you can start constraining yourself to material, you end up having to get kind of creative solutions. And 3D printing at least allows you to have a ton of kind of option and creativity, because you can kind of build and print whatever. Whereas you start getting into machining and all these other crazy materials, there's limitations on what you can make. Yeah, to me, just any kind of 3D printed plastic, at least for the smaller weight classes, just allows you to have so much more fun and kind of get wild and crazy. So to me, that's kind of my favorite medium to work in.
Orion, what's your favorite material?
Well, I started building plate steel AR400 robots pretty early on compared to a lot of other builders, and it's just so much faster to build a robot that way than any other way that I've tried. So the first version of Electric Boogaloo was a tube steel chassis. We were basically just copying Ray Billings, you know, Last Right's 4130 1-inch chromoly tube steel chassis, and just applying it to our design. And we spent weeks like doing tube fitment and fish mouthing tubes and welding inside tight corners and all that stuff. And the second version that never competed that I designed, after I got the plasma cut parts, which were about the same price as the tubes, except they were already cut and CNC'd, it took me by myself one weekend to clean up all those parts and weld them together. It's just a huge time saver. So that's my favorite. And so both versions of Skorpios and Rex were all AR400. It's relatively inexpensive. It's just a, you know, high carbon manganese steel with just some heat treatment on it. It's CNC plasma cuts and laser cuts easy. It welds pretty easy. I mean, there's some stuff that you can do to make it weld easier, but even if you just weld it like it was mild steel and just crank the heat up a little bit, it pretty much just sticks together, and it's pretty nice. I mean, it's used on tractors as much as it's used as, you know, targets on a rifle range. So it's a great material. Love it.
So Leanne, what is your favorite material to use in design?
It's really difficult because, like, if I pick one, I was like, oh, titanium, because it's expensive and like it works really well, but it's brittle. So I think I'm just gonna say the bold thing of aluminum, because there's probably going to be some element that's aluminum in most things I design. Also, when you have things like exometry and send cut send, where you can just like hit go, have parts in a week or whatever, is great. And aluminum makes that actually kind of affordable. I do like 3D printed stuff too. I don't know. I have multiple children, different specialties. Can't just pick one as the favorite, but I'd probably say that aluminum's probably what I'll back, because also billet porn is always great. So
amen to that. Isaak, what is your favorite material to play with?
I'm just going to go with plastics of any kind at any scale. For a while, some people had a nickname for me on the forum, which was Plastic Ant-Man, because I was just building so much more stuff out of plastic than other builders. I'll 3D print more stuff than other builders, and even in the heavier weight classes, I'll choose plastics. I just really like how cheap they are, how easy to machine they are. You know, you can get a 4x8 sheet of inch thick UHMW for way cheaper than you can get any kind of metal, and they're lower density, so it's not really like comparing, you know, is a quarter inch of UHMW better than a quarter inch of aluminum. It's comparing, is an inch thick of UHMW better than a quarter inch of aluminum. And I just always find the flexibility and durability of them to be really good too. So I'll say plastics of any kind.
I like that. All right, and then we'll just throw it over to Ellis. So Ellis, what is your very favorite material to play with?
Sorry, I've not been listening. I've just been looking at my cat and Leanne's cat the whole time. It's not fair going last because everyone's already said what I wanted to say, but I want to touch kind of briefly on Orion on that sort of side of like water jet cut in like obviously in the US it's known as AR plate. In the UK we call it Hardox, same stuff basically. I started off because I didn't have the ability to weld. I started off with water jet cut frames that were held together with basically massive nut strip and just keying everything in and bolting it all in. It's very heavy and not very space efficient, but the cool thing is that you can really carefully isolate where damage actually then transfers through to. So if you've got a welded chassis and you get a big hit on one side, then the whole thing can twist. But if you've got panels that are kind of bolted together, then with some careful design, you can take a hit and you can really kind of nicely predict how that's going to deform and where, and potentially take an entire panel off and very easily flatten it and put it back on, as against to if a whole frame goes and it fails and it twists, then it's basically never the same again. So big fan of that process. And same as Isaak, shout out to, again, you guys call it UHMW or UHMWPE. We call it HDPE, same stuff. Hey, I think she's done. And just there are some things that you absolutely can't do with metals that you can do with plastics. An example would be my featherweight neon, which is a crazy, it's actually quite like Valkyrie. It's like a crazy big undercutter underneath two wheels that doesn't like staying on the ground very much, flies around a lot. And the only reason it works is because it's plastic and it absorbs its own shocks, and it wouldn't really work any other way. So, and actually, final point, interesting observation is that actually Hardox or AR plate is very springy, and that's possibly something that people that might be starting out maybe aren't so aware of. It's very hard, as it would suggest by being called Hardox, but when you get it out to that scale of a heavyweight frame, it's very flexible. And actually so if I wanted to do something which in an insect or a featherweight I did with plastics, I might actually consider titanium or Hardox because they're both very springy materials at that scale.
Thank you. That was a great answer. So this is going to have to be the end of our panel. We could obviously talk about this for another 2, 3, 7 hours, but we have limited time here at the Miami Maker Faire. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists and to Cats for joining us today. You guys were fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the Maker Faire, everybody. It's going on for the rest of today, and you can watch everything online after the fact. So thank you guys very much.
Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. It's the
Bye,
awkward Zoom
everybody.
wave.
Zoom wave.